We want to move now into a panel discussion on how we can be welcoming to these people, how we can show love and look them in the eye and really mean it when we say we're here to care about you, we want you here. And so we're going to talk about, again, how these, how we maybe respond to some of the more extreme moments or the things that evoke fear in us. Not to say that's the only thing that happens. In fact, it's more rare than it does, but so that we can kind of ease this fear and move on to more ways we can be welcoming. So with that said, we will start with our question here today, and that's how can, I'm sorry, I'm gonna move my little guy here. How can we understand or make sense of severe mental health symptoms without stigmatizing? How can we do this?
I like to think of it as the brain short circuits, messages are not sent and received adequately. So the brain and therefore the individual responds sometimes erratically.
Thank you.
With regard to stigma reduction, I want to punctuate a point that was actually made by the adult administrator, Voices from the Pew, and what she essentially said is that mental health challenges, they don't emerge because of moral weakness or because of a character failure. And if we as a church, as a community can disabuse ourselves of that notion, I think we're well on our way to being welcoming. And secondly, I also think that we need to take a step back and to think about, is this a behavior that just occurs in life? So noticing that behaviors and emotions occur on a continuum. It can be a part of the normative culture within a particular context or setting. There might be a point at which we start to ask, is this behavior above a certain threshold? So just for a quick example, let's take positive emotions. I say affect. So a person might be satisfied. They're just content with what's happening. A little bit further on, they might actually be feeling happy. A word I might use is euthymic. So they're really pleased with what's going on in their life. Or to make it even more intense, they might be elated, beaming, gregarious. They're excited, they're boisterous. And then maybe on an extreme, we might use the term manic, where that individual is talking excessively, they're frenzied, they're unresponsive to what's going on around them. If we can normalize affect, normalize emotions, normalize behavior, realizing that there's a range, first of all, I think that makes it less scary and that we can put it into context. Yes, there's a threshold, and yes, there's, culturally prescribed ways of acting, and we might say, you've crossed the line now, I'm a little bit concerned, but otherwise just expand our tolerance for what we might see and what we expect within any community, even within worship settings.
That's good. Thank you. Okay, we'll move to the next question here. How can we understand the role of pastor compared to the role of mental health professional in our lives? I might just offer it as you, did you have Terry, do you want to answer that?
I just noticed that, again, going back to the Voices from the Pew, that Reverend Tracy Sigmund, I believe, said it quite aptly when she was describing how individuals come to her, especially because she's so open about the fact that she has a mental illness. So that mom with the son who was reluctant to take medication. So the pastor is often the first person that the many individuals in various communities will go to. They might even go to the pastor first before going, to a healthcare professional, just because of the trust factor. So in some ways, pastors are the first line of defense, clergy are the first line of defense, and then they might be in positions of doing what I call triage, assessment, and disposition. What's going on? How severe is it? And do I need to refer you on? So in some ways, I look at them as providing a really important public service to the community, whereas the mental health professional might take the ball from there if there's ongoing treatment that's needed.
Yeah. I might offer thoughts. And Heather, I know you're in both worlds like myself, but the idea when I was trained in seminary, I was trained theologically. I was trained for somewhat how to, do liturgical worship and how to do pastoral care as it related to just kind of listening and talking with people, sitting with people. We call it the ministry of presence. You sit with somebody and walk with them emotionally in your presence with people. As a therapist, I was trained very differently, and I was trained not to give advice, not to share faith concepts, not to talk theologically. I actually don't share much of anything. I ask questions most of the time only. And I ask questions that are calculated in the sense that we are trained in multiple theories of different questioning that allow the person to facilitate their own kind of healing and thoughts around their issue. So I see them different in that a pastor really guides and shepherds and brings people from a point to another in a more prescribed way of thinking, whereas a therapist really has no agenda and thought processes in terms of integrating thoughts, but really you're there to process, say, an emotion or process a situation so that you can pull from what your pastor taught you, pull from what your mother taught you, pull from these kind of cultural and spiritual resources that are already inside of you. So I typically tell people we're coming at maybe an issue in a very different tactic. And so you might use pastor or therapist in those way. And like you said, Terry, that certain mental illness issues you refer out to a therapist, mainly because we're just trained on how the psyche works and how the brain works and how emotion works in a way that as a seminarian, I just didn't get the same training on. If you want to add that.
I think one thing I might add to that is that a relationship with a therapist is a goal-oriented relationship. Mm-hmm. So when you work with a therapist, you come in for a reason, you make a treatment plan, you accomplish your goals, and you generally terminate. But your relationship with your clergy person is unless you work in, say, like chaplaincy or, work in an itinerant ministry. If you're a pastor in a church situation, this is an ongoing relationship. Mm-hmm. The boundaries are different, but the person coming to you isn't asking you to fix their current struggle. They're not saying, hey, my serotonin level is super low. Can you prescribe me an antidepressant?
Hopefully, that's right.
Your goal as a pastor is to refer what you can't do and then do what you're called to do, not to do both.
We'll go into boundaries, but I appreciate that. It's a great segue into what are boundaries and why are they important and how can we understand them through our faith lens, if you want to kind of continue in that.
Sure, yeah. So first and foremost, I always view boundaries as a gift. Boundary is what says, this is where you begin and where I end. And in the church, our boundaries can get really, really messy, particularly when we're trying to be someone's therapist and their pastor. But everyone has to be clear on boundaries implicitly or explicitly, preferably explicitly, if we're really to do community well. And I believe that is what God calls us to be God's beloved community. So I would say in terms of boundaries, know yourself, know your training. A lot of pastors are trained in some kind of pastoral counseling, but there are limits to that. There are limits for me as a professional counselor. If I don't diagnose people with schizophrenia, for example, I send them on to psychologists and then on to psychiatrists for medication. So a big part of our job is knowing what's ours to do and what's not. And I think the thing that I would beg church leaders to do is to put policies and procedures around all of these words. So it's fine to say, we're a welcoming church, but how does that play out in your congregation's lived experience? So if you have somebody who is, for example, I have a child with autism and I'm not always at church, and my husband is the choir director and a musician. So what happens if my daughter has an autistic meltdown in the middle of the congregation? I can't just expect somebody to pick her up and know what to do. We have to have lines of defense in place that say, okay, if mom's not at church because she's at work and dad is busy, then, and I've named 3 adults who I've said, can you please help with my daughter? I trust you. You're background checked. who know how we treat my daughter's disorder, and what to do with it. So, at the end of the day, all I really care about is that everybody knows what their job is, and we have a way to lay hands on the ways in which we engage with people. But that's not to say that we don't have to make some changes. For example, we live, our congregation is situated in a place that has a high, extremely high poverty rate, and a lot of people experiencing homelessness come into our church because we provide a free breakfast in the morning. That was a ministry we wanted to do. But one of the things that meant, safety doesn't mean, like, being welcoming doesn't mean being stupid. And so we moved the children's nursery with a half door that's directly off the kitchen. We moved the nursery downstairs because while we want to be a welcoming church, and while we recognize that very few persons who have mental health concerns are dangerous, we do require background checks for anybody who's with our children, and therefore we made it possible for persons coming in off the street and our children to coexist in safety.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else have ideas of boundaries, and what are they, and how do we make sense of them in our faith? We do have another question around, it might be the same, but what are some practical implications? We heard some, but what are some practical ways we can implement these into our congregational setting?
I think our implementation of boundaries is guided by the admonition from Christ to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Whatever we do with people should be done with love.
Mm-hmm.
We should help those who are weak or sick.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, helping someone or being there for someone has guidelines. We're not engaging in a way that threatens us or threatens other relationships.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. I just want to add about the idea of boundaries. Aside from any kind of mental illness or mental health challenges, we in the church just should have better boundaries in general, and that's just relational boundaries. Unfortunately, our pastors are tasked with everything. They got to do everything, and so as a field, as a career, as an organization, having boundaries interrelationally is just important. And one way that I've seen just in my own world as being a therapist and a clergy member is naming my skills. So there are moments where I know I'm doing clinical skills and I'm about to do a clinical skill, so that I'm going to posture myself emotionally, even physically, differently than when I do a pastoral skill. If I'm a pastor, I might say, I'm going to do a business skill right now. I'm going to do a pastoral skill. I'm going to do a theological skill. That we start naming for people all the different skills and tasks we're doing, and even for ourselves, so that we emotionally can change how we relate to the situation. Another practical thing I want to bring in, I worked with children who are physically and sexually abused. And so physical boundaries is something that always comes up for me in congregational settings. That some of us, I'm a hugger, and the churches we're a lot, typically more, we touch each other differently. And just being aware that that might be really necessary for someone who's struggling, who's feeling isolated, and having touch is very important for their treatment or their healing. And it also might be very triggering and not healthy. And so I typically ask people now, can I shake your hand? Can I hug you? I also talk to kids about this as well. And we use planets. And we talk about, if you're on Pluto, who's on Pluto? If you're on Pluto versus Venus versus Mars, these are the stages in terms of who can touch you where and how they can be close to you, or what kind of intimate levels they should have. It's a great way to talk to anybody, but really talking openly about boundaries, whether it's physical, financial, emotional, that we get more, elaborative of this in the church, regardless of mental health. It's just something we all need. And I think someone was going to say something else about that.
I wanted to add with regard to healthy boundaries is that, let's say that there are individuals in our congregation who we know have some mental health challenges and sometimes might be disruptive. You have an ongoing relationship, you've made referrals. There's a point at which it's okay for us to set a boundary, like having a verbal contract with that individual, so that if you respond in this way, you can expect that I might contact your family member. I might suggest that you call your therapist, whatever it is. But I think it's appropriate and it's indicated for us actually to have some sort of contract at times with individuals with whom we have a relationship. It's based on the relationship. But for me, when I think about boundaries, you can have really rigid boundaries where you're detached and not involved, or they can be too diffuse, as I know Heather and Judy have mentioned, where there's enmeshment. We don't know where you begin or I end. And we're suggesting is it's loving and it's appropriate and it's Christian of us to be sort of in the middle, being loving and firm at the same time, ensuring that you are caring for yourself by following up in the ways that we have supported you to do. We're going to support you as a church, and we're concerned enough to have you follow through and care for yourself in certain kinds of ways. So we're setting this contract.
Yeah. We'll keep talking about various examples of boundaries.